Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 39th Virtual History of 2021. My name is Molly Ricks, and I am with Baltimore Heritage. First, I want to thank everyone who donated to be with us here today. Your support enables Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation to host these virtual histories each week. So just a few announcements before we get started. Next week, we will be joined by UMBC professor, Dr. Ann Rubin, who will be discussing the virtual project Slave Streets, Free Streets, Visualizing the Landscape of Early Baltimore, which allows users to virtually stroll 1815 Baltimore. And she'll be discussing ways in which technology can reconstruct the past in exciting ways, such as through video games. So that's for next week. And then for our final virtual history of the year, it will be on December 17th, and we will be joined by Mahan Reikiel to learn about the design of the recently reopened Rash Field. So now for today's presentation, we're pleased to have Dr. Ida Jones with us here today, and she is an American historian and author who is the University Archivist at Morgan State University, and this is the first archivist in the university's history. Her work is focused on DC and Baltimore area African-American history, letting the voices and lived experiences of people tell their stories. She has published 4 books, including one on the subject of today's presentation. And that book is called Baltimore Civil Rights Leader Victorine Adams. And if you have any questions, please add them to the chat in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And with that, take it away, Ida. Thanks for being here.
Good afternoon, Molly, and good afternoon, everyone else. TGIF, I want to thank the Baltimore Heritage area for inviting me to present on today. I hope we can learn something about Victorine Adams. What is of interest is that I don't do architecture, but I do know that her home has been purchased, and there actually is a Morgan student and her family living in the home, so at Carlisle Avenue. So what I will do is share her life and history. And so today's presentation is called Disrupting Lines, the Career and Legacy of Victorine Adams. And as we were having pre-presentation conversation, this is her in 1974 at a women's fair about voting. So you see in the very far back, the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee of Maryland. They started in 1946, we'll talk about them, and then also some of the aims of how she sought to get women involved in the idea of voting. So Victorine Adams was born on April 28, 1912 to Joseph Quill and Estelle Tate Quill at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. And she graduated from the Frederick Douglass High School in 1928, and then Coppin Normal School in 1930, and then Morgan State College in 1940. After a decade of teaching in 1946, she founded the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, which encouraged Black women to register to vote and to recruited them to run for public office. Of note is that her mother was a transplant from Virginia and her father was from the Eastern Shore. It's my understanding that there are a number of Quills still in Maryland who most likely might have some kind of relationship, kinship ties to Victorine. I have not done that deep dive. If anyone has any insight they're willing to share, I look forward to it. As for her education, they were all public schools in the city of Baltimore, all racially segregated, all Black schools, and Coppin Normal School is now Coppin State University, as well as Morgan now is Morgan State University. So pictured here is a lovely portrait of her, probably around a high school graduation age. Here she is with teaching at the, I think it's Robert Elliott Elementary School. And then here she's pictured with her brother. She is 6, he is 2. And so all these pictures are in the collection. For my fellow preservation persons, you see the lovely thumbtacks that secure these pictures, but thankfully they actually survived. So they are here. So Victorine Adams was a teacher at the Robert Brown Elliott School in 1930, Baltimore, and they were racially segregated schools. The early civil rights activists were able to comprised of public school teachers. So the beautiful thing about that is, as a public school teacher, what she was able to do with other school teachers is really create the proto-vanguard of the civil rights movement. So here she is. You can see she's rather petite because one of her charges is nearly 3/4 her height. I love this photograph because it really has a lot of depth and warmth to it about how elementary school education was going forth in that early quarter or first half of the 20th century. And once again, all the images are from her collection. So she was also a club woman. She belonged to a variety of clubs representing various aspects of her life. These organizations allowed women to harness their intellectual and financial power to remedy the ills and to fill the voids in their community. She held membership in Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, of which we share. She was also a member of the National Council of Negro Women, of which we all share. She was a charter member of the Baltimore section. I'm a life member, looking for a section. And then she was also a member of the National Association of Negro Business and Professional Women's Clubs and the Iota Phi Lambda Sorority. And this is the picture of Iota Phi Lambda Sorority in 1958, in which Victorine was being feted as Woman of the Year. And so I do love this picture as well. My mother left me one of these furs, which I thought was rather haunting because we had a pre-presentation discussion about foxes. And so the eyes and the mouth are the clip, and it's just a little jarring, but that was kind of high fashion at that time. As you see, the women are all resplendent in dress and adornment. So when we talk about the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, their motto said, if democracy is worth fighting for, it's worth voting for. Its members sought to welcome all women, register all, and enlighten all, interest more women in politics, stimulate and educate the public on the value of the ballot, register more voters, get the vote out at election time, and take part in the civic, political, and social progress of the city. Pictured here is a gentleman named Mr. Goodman. You'll have to get the book for the further details, but he was a candidate. And so what she would do is invite people to her home, candidates and members of her club, to have conversation and interrogate the candidates about their agenda with regards to what the constituency of the group believed they needed in their neighborhood and in their community. Here's another photograph where they were visiting senators and congressmen on the Hill from Maryland. The caption is also in the book, but nevertheless, you see this woman was also a member of the Iota Phi Lambda sorority. So you see a great level of overlap. And here is Victorine, smartly dressed as well, and all women wearing hats. And this is a recording and reporting information. So the Women's Democratic Campaign Committee would use their membership to surveil public meetings and gather intel to come back to inform membership about how to think about the vote. And they had instructions about those who would be delegates. And it says, do not overdress, be neat, wear a hat and gloves, no slip showing, please, no loud talking, be alert at all times, speak clearly if called upon, and give your name and title. Make sure to mention Miss or Mrs., registered voter, and interested in good government. Take a friend with you if you can, the more the merrier. However, only the delegate or the alternate will be paid. If you cannot go at the appointed time, let us know, or better still yet, get a substitute, a lady in the club. So it was rather structured. It wasn't just random in terms of some of this. And it's important for us to understand the reason why this forms is because there is a suffrage bill that passes in 1920. Maryland does not ratify that till 1941, and they don't vote on the ratification until 1958. So Maryland was like very many Southern states that sought to kind of nullify and or ignore the federal legislation of the 19th Amendment, to not have African-American women support Black men, to swing the pendulum of balance. So they just simply chose to ignore it. There were episodes where women could vote, so it wasn't written into law. It was just simply kind of ignored. In 1941, it was voted upon, and in 1958, it was ratified. So what her doing the Colored Women's Club in 1946 shows you that she was really seeking to have women understand the power of the ballot, at least African-American women. And in the collection is a voting machine so that people could actually engage the technology, to not be afraid of the technology and how to pull the lever. I don't have a picture of that in my presentation, but maybe in the future I can probably put one up and share with the Baltimore Heritage community. So here's a picture of Victorine, smartly dressed here, and the CWDCC affiliated with the Red Cross, the NAACP Community Fund, the Urban League, the League of Women's Clubs, the Association to Abolish the Poll Tax, Women's League for Peace and Freedom, and the Send a Girl to Camp. And so we all know this person here is Lily Carroll Jackson. And then we all might not know who this person is, but he's rather prominent, Willard Allen, in Morgan history. He was on the board of trustees here. He was also the most worshipful Grand Master of the Maryland Prince Hall Grand Lodge. So he had great extensive reach, And the other men and women in the picture do not have captions to their names. So I'm still trying to harvest the names of these persons and get captions to them. Once again, if you know, I'd love to hear if you're familiar with any of these people. So when we look at the history of the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, Senator Harry Cole was their first success and their first election. So Senator Cole, pictured here, attended racially segregated schools as well. He received his degree from Morgan in 1943. He served in World War II, and he obtains his law degree from the University of Maryland in 1949. He was the first African-American lawyer hired as the Assistant State Attorney General in Maryland. What is very interesting is that my colleague, Matthew Crenson, says that in 1920s, Baltimore, the Democratic Party had limited leverage with Black voters. He says patronage and favors attracted a minority of Black Baltimoreans to the Democrats. Principally, African Americans were Republicans at that time. In Baltimore, segregation and overt racism threatened the expanding Democratic Party. Similar to the nation, the white-Black balance needed to be maintained unless Southern whites were antagonized and would leave the party, the Democratic Party. The tenuous threads benefited Jack, some say Polak, some say Pollock. I was told Polak, so it could be Polak or Pollock. If anyone has definitive information about that, I'm listening, please share. Whose political territory included judges and city and state lawmakers. Towards this end, the Black-White Alliance could form because race was a bargaining chip where Black votes enriched white politicians. So they were literally buying votes. And this is not unique to Baltimore. Political machines existed. I think the Daily Machine in Chicago just recently fell in the late 90s. So every major city had a political machine. So when Harry Cole announces his bid for the state Senate, this disturbs Pollack's plan and a selected candidate. In 1954, a very amazing year in American history, Cole defeats the Pollack candidate, and he initiated a successful unraveling of Pollack's grip over the African-American community on the west side of Baltimore. However, Cole's victory was not without contention. So Dr. Crenson goes further to say that the November results are being rechecked by December because of a slim margin of 37 votes and one voter's signature. Bernard Melnikov lost to Cole and sought to have the ballots checked. Now, Melnikov's needling was very interesting because the Afro reported that Cole spent over $2,200 on his campaign, while Melnikov spent less than $700. And we know that campaign investments with advertising and airtime all really do affect how people vote. On October 16, a dinner was hosted to benefit the coalition ticket for McKeldin, for the governor, as well as support for Cole. Cole was able to garner $1,300 from that gathering. And at that gathering, there were people along Morgan, people in his fraternity, and people in the community that supported Cole because they wanted to see him win. Interesting enough, after the recheck of the votes, it was found there was no fraud, and he was sworn in as the first African-American state senator in Maryland history. And his victory proved that an informed and organized voting community could affect change. His first piece of legislation he introduces in March of '55 is Senate Bill 219. And that bill sought to provide equal rights for all persons in public accommodations and resorts and amusement. What he asked for was punitive charges to be fined against those institutions violating this proposed law. So from $100 to $500, if they did not, in certain public accommodations, equally provide for races, they would be fined. In April of '55, the penalty clause killed the Civil Rights Bill when white Republicans abandoned their party man, Cole, and aligned with the white Democrats, believing that progress takes time, and therefore penalizing people for attempting to change is unfair. So Cole would only serve one term in the state Senate. The CWDCC also had an affiliate, and they were called Minutemen. And I have an affinity for Minutemen being from New England. But these men, we actually have names for them: Sid Noor, William White, Caesar Jones, James Morris, and Dallas Davis, are here with the idea of register and vote Minutemen. So they're going to go into mail spaces. I think that might be actually in front of a barber shop, which is very interesting, possibly along Pennsylvania Avenue, to get African-American men to vote. There was some degree of apathy and indifference, and it's very fascinating to see how they really sought to engage men, Victorine, through using men to do such. So she knew there was a limit to respect men in male spaces. They also sought to make the political process relatable. So there was lots of social campaigns to acknowledge those entities that were far more progressive in their efforts at integration. This is a picture of the Baltimore Bullets, and that caption is also in the book. But here is a Victorine, once again, against probably a player for the Baltimore Bullets, celebrating their efforts at being racially integrated and seeking to kind of build bridges between racial lines. In 1958, interesting, another time in which the state of Maryland ratified the 1941 vote, on August 19th, Victorine, pictured here from her scrapbook with Ethel P. Rich, co-founded Woman Power Incorporated. This group would be regional in scope and proliferated through branches. All the branches were subject to the rules and regulation of the national body, which was located here in Baltimore. It initially started out to mobilize Black women, but eventually, as you saw in the first slide, it meant all women. So it was to get them involved in political action and power, to get them involved in community involvement, and also to be committed to educational activities. Because she always thought of younger people needing to be involved and being aware of their civic responsibility. So the political action took the form of voter registration and getting people physically to the polls, as well as teaching and learning and educating about the political process. We here at Morgan State had a gentleman by the name of James Fleming, pictured here, George James Fleming, who was the political scientist, basically the founding dean of the political science department. And so he actually taught, and we have his collection here, where there are syllabi about grassroots movement and other kinds of activities. Mayor D'Alessandro, Verda Welcome, and Victorine Adams would come to campus during his political institutes to talk with the students about the nature of politics and have them become socially and civically engaged, where theory met real world activity. He even had a model UN here where the students could actually engage in global issues in not just theory, but in real time. So in this picture here, we see Victorine next to the rostrum. This gentleman here is Martin Jenkins, the second African-American president of Morgan. And then I can't quite tell who this gentleman is. We all know who this gentleman is, a Mitchell. And then way over here is Juanita Jackson Mitchell. This picture was taken in 1958 at the Baltimore Belvedere Hotel. It was believed to be the first integrated public event held there. And so they were also doing great historical inroads with this. I can't tell who the gentleman at the rostrum is as well. So once again, I'm always looking for some assistance, being a non-native of Baltimore. So this gentleman I know, very familiar, and it's also captioned. So what happens in 1967, then Mayor William Donald Schaefer on October 22nd, 1967, acknowledges Women's Power Incorporation Day. And I have some lovely oral histories in my conversations with Senator Mikulski and former Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark about how Schaefer called them council girls. And he always called Victorine councilwoman. So I don't know if it was the looming shadow of Willie Adams, her husband, that really caused him to have some level of deference to her. But Mary Pat Clark and Senator Mikulski were very clear that Schaefer was kind of an odd bird. I do like this image here in terms of what this looks like. The caption for this book is all caption for this picture is in the book. And this man here to the far left is Loyal Randolph. And Victorine does talk in her papers about how he inspired her and mentored her in politics. And this man to her right, or her left, excuse me, my right, is her husband, Willie Adams. And we know him for a variety of things, but one thing he was a loyal husband of nearly 70 plus years, and actually supported her campaign both economically and morally and such. So there was great affinity between the two of them, where she was allowed to be fully an independent woman, considering the vintage she is growing up in, where some women were limited because of their gender. So so this little statement right here, she believed that different perspectives enriched the community, and together in elected office was stronger than remaining on the sidelines. So in 1966, she was elected to the state Senate, Victorine Adams. She leaves that position and runs for the city council in 1967 and is elected. And she believed that she needed to be in the city because Verda Welcome and another African-American woman were on the state level, but there was nobody in the city that was going to be able to help legislate for those in the city. So she decided to come to the council and becomes the first African-American woman to serve on the Baltimore City Council. Here she is at her headquarters in Mondawmin Mall, a place that her husband, Willie Adams, helped to create. In her papers is a quote by Lerone Bennett, great historian of Johnson Publications, and he says the mission of the Black politician is to do what white politicians have failed to do: define and actualize liberty and equality as a faith and a way of life. In the final analysis, not to mend the petty conflicts of the moment, nor to close some tiny gap in the discourse of the day. That is the historic mission of the Black politician, advancing designs and policies for 1,000 tomorrows for Blacks and whites alike. And I thought that was very profound because she does do that over the course of her 4 terms in the city council. So when we look at her legacy, making a difference is what she did. She taught elementary school. She invested in social movements that appealed to her sense of justice during her adulthood. She founded the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. She campaigned for public office, placing herself within the halls of power to craft compassionate legislation benefiting all Baltimoreans. And here she is once again in her campaign headquarters with a woman I'd love to know whose name, once again, no caption, where she has this lovely statement where she's saying, keep the voice of the people in the city council, and a V for vote for Victorine. So I want to thank you for your time, and I would suggest that you check out the book at Enoch Pratt Library. They are for sale on Amazon as well. I will gladly entertain your questions. I see some things popping off in the chat, which I'll get to, but I want to thank you for your time and look forward to your conversation and questions. So thank you.
Ida, thank you so much. That was wonderful, and what an incredible woman. And so we have one question here. Someone says Cole's win in term occurred in 1954 at the same time as Brown v. Board. Mm-hmm. Did the Brown case affect Cole's winning or resistance to his term?
That's a good question. I'm not a political scientist. I wish I had Matt Crenson here to answer for me, but we know that there was so much shifting in the 1950s, both domestically as well as internationally. I definitely think it would have been a threat, and that's why the Republicans switched and backed the Democrats, because there was so much demanding change by African Americans in this city and in this country that would disrupt the status quo, that I think it led to his one-term time. Because if he had been able to get that legislation through, it would have unraveled a power structure that was in place that was benefiting economically, socially, politically, employment, all of the reasons why to keep that vertical racial relationship. So I do believe that definitely that confluence of that federal law that happened with Brown, undoing Plessy, the bus boycotts that are coming, the student protests that are happening, the independent African nations and the Caribbean nations seeking a lot is going on. And that was just shocking, the white supremacy power structure of that era. So I definitely think that was contributed.
Let's see, we have another one here. Have you reached out to people at Union Baptist Church, Bethel AME, Sharp Street, Douglas Memorial? The older folks especially could help you maybe identify some of the people.
Yes, that was my intention in 2019, way before the simmering summers or winters of our pandemic. So yes, I have intended to do so. And I actually have met some alumni. And there's one gentleman that someone did say that was somebody's husband. Didn't write it down. So I probably need to do that again and scan the pictures and send them out to people to take a look at them with magnification. But yeah, I will definitely be reaching out, as well as her church, St. Peter Claver Church, because that's where she attended.
Great. Well, if there's no other questions there, I have some questions. At the beginning, you mentioned that her house was recently purchased and a Morgan student lives in it now. Is that the house in Hanlon Park?
Yes, it's the house in Hanlon Park. And my colleague, Dr. Howell, was doing some kind of sidewalk tour with somebody. And she was kind of like, why are they looking at my house? Why are they taking pictures? So she came out somewhat disturbed, like, what are you doing? And so there's been, I guess, with Johns Hopkins, with his heritage tours he's been doing since the pandemic, the 5-minute histories, people are like, what is going on? So she didn't know who lived in her house or who had the house before her. And we, to be a student at Morgan, a graduate student, I believe, she's a mature person, was like, wow, what great synergy. So now she's not as kind of buffaloed by people walking by kind of gawking at her home. So yeah, great kismet.
Wow, that's wonderful. Another question here, has Little Willie's reputation overshadowed Victorine?
It has, and that's why I really try to focus on her. And the fun fact here is that people can, either demonize or deify Willie Adams. But for African American history, my perspective is he and she were both race men and women. And at that time, every non-WASP had an underground economy, because if you were not white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant that came across with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, then you had to find a way to make your economy. So most white ethnics, as well as other persons of color, had to create their own economy. So the numbers rackets, as they call it now, or Elliot Ness and all that other kind of stuff with the G-men of the 50s and such, that was a way to make money. And so to do that is what he did. And he really became a millionaire, literally. There's still a scholarship that they give posthumously to African-American students seeking to go to college. So his philanthropy comes out of this underground economy. As it becomes more seedy and more derogatory with drugs and prostitution, he's not doing that. He was only running numbers. And so he is basically demonized for that. And Larry Gibson did explain to me that there was a wiretap in the early 80s, and the person with whom he was speaking with went to jail, but Adams did not, because he knew his phone was tapped. So it's like basically not saying, I know I stole the fox from the chicken house or something. You don't do that. So that person did go to jail, but Adams himself never went to jail, but everyone around him seemingly ended up in jail. It's very interesting.
Wow. Yeah. That really is wiretaps.
Yeah.
So another question here, did she have children? And if so, what have they done?
Yes, there was a pregnancy, but it was a non-viable birth. So, and with him, there was a child, I believe, pre-marriage who had some intellectual delay, but that person, I believe, is still living and has children in Florida. I've not really researched that thread. There was a gentleman that wrote the book, Little Willie. They call me Little Willie. I've tried to reach out to him to no success or avail for whatever reasons. Interestingly enough, there's nothing of him in her collection. You would think there'd be love notes or letters or cards. He has no footprint in any printed material whatsoever. And I understand because he was a polymath, he did not have the luxury to go to school as for a full academic year. He was really self-taught, and he had a brilliant mind. He really had a photographic memory. So when the police did catch him in I think it was the 40s, he had no chips or those little slips they would keep on them when they were running numbers. My uncle, who just turned 86, said when he was about 5 or 6, the man said, take this across the street. So he was just taking the paper across the street for whatever pennies or nickels the man was giving him. And when my grandfather saw that, he's like, what are you doing? He's like, the man said, take it across. He's like, no more. So my uncle was a numbers runner, right? So it was very interesting when he talks about this at 86 years old. But Willie, he had no paper. He never had paper. But what he did have was cash, tons of cash. And Park Sausages, the company that is here, he actually used cash, a release of $87,000 as the down payment, because you couldn't get loans. Banks would not loan to African Americans, and all the other ugliness that American banking had done. So when they said, what's the collateral against us giving this loan to this business? He said, you want your money? Here it is. If he defaults, you have your cash. Give him the loan. Crazy. So, but that was amazing. So apparently this cash was, untaxable income. Where did all this cash come from? So that definitely raised the radar. But yet again, it's my understanding that in 1970, that the state of Maryland hires him to run their lotto system. And they actually use Willie's formula and his actual physical brain to do this.
Wow, so full circle there. Another question here. Some have said that authorities went after Willie in part because he and Victorine broke the color barrier in Hanlon. True or false?
That's probably part of it. There's a colleague of mine who does Afrofuturism, and she talks about this term fractals. Apparently it's a scientific term that bits and pieces of something over time gather and then lead to this cataclysmic situation, like the Big Bang. Like we don't have a date, like, pre-BC, something, whatever, but these little bits of things. So I think that was a fractal. It was a piece of the overall effort, his Teflon capacity to not be killed in 1938 when their house was firebombed, to be able to partner with Russian Jews who were very well also in this underground economy and had legitimized their business, to kind of keep Italians and other mid-Atlantic persons coming into Baltimore to take the numbers racket. He was too successful. And then there is, quote, the black tax. And then she herself, extremely educated and well-connected. This power couple was just not the narrative we're trying to have with, quote, those people. So I think that definitely was part of it. And that's why to this day, some people will still say, oh yeah, Little Willie, that guy. He was not Al Capone, okay? And so that's huge.
Absolutely. When did Victorine and Little Willie Adams pass?
Well, she passed away in 2008, I believe. She was 93 years old. And I understand that he did eventually acquire dementia, which is amazing for a brilliant mind to go in such a sour way. And he dies, I think, in 2011. He dies after her.
Wow. And this is just a question now for me. As the university archivist, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about her collection. Like, how big is it? How did the university come to obtain it? Was this a plan of hers to give it to Morgan?
Great question. Yes, thanks for the article question. Yes, so apparently I've met some librarians who were working here in the 70s and 80s, and they remember her visiting the Soper Library. We're now in the Richardson Library, which is 250,000 square foot of library. But the smaller library that was beside us has been removed. But she actually would come and visit the old Soper Library to see the facilities and was very intentional before her retirement from the city council that her papers were coming to Morgan. And she wanted to see the space and really ensure that they arrived here. I want to say they arrived around the time of her death because Dr. Deborah Newmanham, former Department of History professor, actually helped with the processing and acquiring of those papers. So when they were brought here, they were in some kind of processed form. I didn't like that, so I reprocessed them. And it's about 25 linear feet of material. They're extremely wealthy in terms of photographs. Her husband created a beach, Elktonia, in, I want to say it was in Annapolis somewhere, down from Carr's Beach. And they actually, because of segregation, they could not go to Ocean City. African Americans were not welcome there. So African Americans created their own resort spaces. So Elktonia Beach actually purchases Carr's Beach, and they're going to have Black radio shows, Black singers out there. And so they're going to have a whole entire space where you can feel comfortable to leisurely have summering out there on the water. And so there are tons of pictures from the beach in the book. I mean, her in her bathing suit, and of course she was such a doll, and they're sunning themselves and they're in the water and they're doing all these things in terms of leisure and resort. So the pictures are extremely rich. Some do have captions, some do not, but the majority have those thumbtack holes, which I think is very interesting how they survived. I don't know where she was hanging them, but at any rate, so that is extremely wealthy. And then of course her work with her organizations. And then I just found another cache of materials of constituency letters. So I did not know this. There were unmarked brown boxes in the storage room. I said, what is in here? Constituency, all these constituency letters. I'm coming back from Vietnam. I've just been laid off from Sparrows Point or Bethlehem Steel. I've been laid off. I need a job. Help me find a job. And they criminalized poverty during that time period. So people had to do what they had to do. So that leads to what we have in the 80s and the 90s. So people are underemployed or unemployed, but they still have to provide for their families. So she sought to bring the Social Security building and the construction here. So she sought to bring big contracts into the city so people could be employed. And at the same time, before Kurt Schmoke gets into politics, the education needs to shift so that people can be trained for the jobs that are coming. So it's amazing what she was trying to do as one person with whatever community of people she was working with.
Okay, and our final question then, what made you become interested in Victorine, or how did you discover her?
Well, I did mention we share two organizations in kind, and I do live in Washington, D.C., and I'd never heard of her. And I said, we actually were breathing the same air at the same time, and we never, in the organization's history, really talked about her. I'm like, what is this about? So I said, someone's going to write a book about this. So I just fell in love with her from that moment because I thought, and then she was a first in politics, which other organizations, other sororities tend to have those kinds of firsts. But for my organization to have a first in that field was like, what? I didn't know this. And she's right here, less than 30 miles from, so it was a personal crusade for me to make sure that she gets her propers, as they say. And so that was the impetus behind the book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Jones, for coming out and sharing this information with us. So important. I just see a question here. Yes, this recording will be available on the Baltimore Architecture Foundation's YouTube page. Just give us a little bit of time to get that up there. And thank you again. And that's it. That's the end.
Thank you so much, and happy holidays, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.